This is the Pechakucha by Brian Patrick, Daniel Kirtley, Dakota Tester, and Matt Morelli. We are comparing the rhetorical elements of Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inaugural address. Our rhetorical elements are tone and metaphors. First of all, let's go to the basics. Tone, in literary terms, is the general attitude of a piece of writing. In further slides, we will go on to elaborate on how the tone of both pieces, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inaugural address and Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, accomplish the speaker's purpose. Another thing also prevalent in both pieces is the presence of metaphors. A metaphor is a comparison of two things without using the words like or as. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God and FDR's inaugural address both use metaphors to help portray to the audience the relevance in two things in comparison with one another. Jonathan Edwards was born in 1703. He will be remembered for years to come regarding his fiery speeches such as Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Edwards spent a lot of his time as a congregational pastor, in which the stories that he wrote were influenced greatly. The Great Awakening, a religious revival, will be sparked by the writings of this man. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882. He was the 32nd President of the United States of America. He was the first and only president to be elected to more than 2 terms. He was also the first president to be handicapped in office. He contracted polio as an adult just before his presidency.
Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God was a speech given on July 8, 1741, in Enfield, Connecticut. Jonathan Edwards' mission was to convert and to convince his congregation of sinners. He did this through powerful sermons. Edwards uses several rhetorical devices that contribute to the effectiveness of his sermon. The main purpose of Jonathan Edwards' moving speech is to start a revolution, and that's exactly what happened. In the early 1700s, Jonathan Edwards noticed a lack of religion in the English colonies. He had to use hellfire and damnation sermons in order to bring the American people out of this religious recession. During the time of President Roosevelt's first inaugural address in early 1933, the United States was still feeling the horrible shock and disappointments of the Great Depression. With this speech, he addressed several issues and major themes that currently surrounded the country at the time, especially the economic panic that was still sweeping the nation. The main purpose of FDR's inaugural speech was to state his mission for the United States government. He wanted to inspire the American people to treat the economic depression as a war. He wanted to stimulate not only the people, but the government as well in order to start this road to recovery. Even though FDR's inaugural speech and Jonathan Edwards' speech are given almost 2 centuries apart, their essential purpose is the same. They both aim to bring change from a previous recession, whether it's religious or economic, and they both accomplish their purpose through the elements of tone and metaphor.
Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God also promotes a sense of urgency. Jonathan Edwards says, quote, God will not hold them up in these slippery places any longer, but will let them go, and then, at that very instant, they shall fall into destruction. While he is let go, he immediately falls and is lost. End quote. He means to influence his audience to act before it's too late by using this sense of urgency to get his message across concisely and accurately. Jonathan Edwards uses phrases like, quote, any longer, at that very instant, and immediately, end quote, to make it clear that he wants action now. In FDR's inaugural address, he gives clear advice to United States citizens. He says, quote, there are many ways in which it can be helped, but it can never be helped merely by talking about it. We must act and act quickly, end quote. The voters wanted a solution to their economic problems, and FDR gave it to them quickly. Another quote he uses to show urgency is, quote, the people of the United States have not failed. In their need, they have registered a mandate that they want direct, vigorous action, end quote. Roosevelt understood that this is what the people wanted. A quick action to save the economy, and he was up to the challenge. Both quotes use logic to motivate the citizens and the country as a whole. FDR wants an immediate reaction and uses his final sentence as a strong single-line motivator. Quote, we must act and act quickly, end quote. This gives us a sense of urgency that cannot be ignored.
Here is an example of a metaphor from Jonathan Edwards' speech. Quote, "He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times more abominable in his eyes than the most hateful venomous serpent is in ours." End quote. This metaphor is truly a call for religion. Jonathan Edwards calls humans more abominable than the most hateful venomous snake. That's pretty harsh. However, it gets his point across. The metaphor causes the audience to want to change and to want to be morally better than a hateful snake in the eyes of God. Edwards strategically uses this metaphor to call for.
One of the greatest quotes from FDR's inaugural address, showing his use of metaphors, is, "We are stricken by no plague of locusts, compared with the perils which our forefathers conquered. Because they believed and were not afraid, we still have much to be thankful for."
Using the metaphor of the plague of locusts helps to develop that idea and the overall purpose. A plague of locusts is one of the worst things that can happen to you. By saying that we haven't seen the worst and that we should be thankful, FDR implies that we need to pick ourselves up and start on the road to recovery. In conclusion, even though FDR's speech and Jonathan Edwards' sermon are entirely different, they employ similar uses of an urgent tone and well-placed metaphors in order to prompt changes in the colonies of the 1700s with sinners in the hands of an angry God, and in America shortly after the Great Depression with FDR's inaugural address.